When I saw the glass of water still standing on the windowsill that morning, my heart skipped, not because of the glass itself, but because I knew what it meant. What it had come to mean. It wasn't just water anymore. It was a message, a silent call, a signal I had created without ever saying a word. I had placed it there absent-mindedly weeks ago, but now its presence, or absence, dictated more than I wanted to admit. That glass was the beginning of everything and the thing that, sooner or later, would destroy me. It's strange, the way a life can pivot on something so small. One glass of water, a glance exchanged at a doorway, a smile that lingers a second too long. That's how it started, with nothing more than that. No grand declarations, no thunderclap of passion. Just an ordinary day, an ordinary delivery, and me, standing at my kitchen window, feeling an ache I didn't know how to name. 3 months ago, if you had asked me, I would have said my marriage was fine. Not extraordinary, not passionate, but fine. The kind of fine that sounds safe but feels like slow erosion. My husband wasn't cruel, he wasn't neglectful in any deliberate way. He was simply gone in the ways that mattered. He filled his life with work, numbers, business trips, and quiet habits, and in the spaces he left behind, I started to wonder if I was fading too. The day I first saw him, the courier, was like every other day until it wasn't. He knocked on the door, smiling with that careless brightness only the very young seem to carry. I noticed the way he held the package, how he looked at me, not past me, not through me, but at me. And for the first time in longer than I can remember, I felt seen. I didn't mean for anything to happen. I didn't plan for signals and glasses of water and nights I can't erase. But I did. And now I'm here, standing in my own kitchen, staring at that glass, wondering if anyone else sees it the way he does. Wondering if my husband will ever notice, or if he'll keep walking past the window like he's been walking past me all these years. Before I tell you the truth I've been carrying like a weight on my chest, tell me this in the comments. Have you ever hidden something so carefully, thinking it would never come out, only to feel it slipping through your fingers anyway? Because that's where my story begins. With a glass of water, a delivery I never expected, and a mistake that would change everything. The mornings are the hardest. Not because they're busy or loud, but because they're empty. I wake up to the sound of my husband's shoes on the hallway tiles, his phone already pressed to his ear, his suitcase always waiting by the door. He leaves before the sun finishes climbing, a coffee cup half drunk on the table like a punctuation mark to his absence. I watch the door close behind him and the silence that follows is thick, as if the whole house exhales and then holds its breath. I used to fill that silence with routine, laundry, lists, the television humming quietly in the background. But somewhere along the way, the routine became something else. It became proof of how invisible I had become, not just to him but to myself. I'd stand in front of the mirror in the bathroom, the one that faces the window, and stare at the woman looking back at me. Her hair was always in place, her clothes neat enough, but her eyes told the truth. They didn't shine anymore. That day, 3 months ago now, the knock on the door startled me because it broke the silence. It was sharp, quick, the sound of someone impatient, someone alive. When I opened it, he was standing there, the courier. Young, maybe mid-20s, though it was hard to tell because he carried himself with the careless ease of someone who didn't think too much about age. He had a small box in his hand and a smile that seemed to come as naturally as breathing. "Delivery for you," he said, holding out the box. His voice wasn't remarkable, not deep or rough or anything you'd notice if you weren't paying attention. But I was paying attention. The way he looked at me made me pay attention. Not in a way that felt wrong, not then. He looked at me like people do when they see someone for the first time, not like my husband, who looks at me the way someone looks at a chair they've owned for years. Reliable, familiar, unnoticed. I signed for the package and he left, and that should have been it. A moment, a brief exchange, nothing more. But when I went back to the kitchen, I realized I was still thinking about his smile. The way he didn't look past me, didn't look at his shoes or his phone, but looked right into my face like it mattered. That afternoon, as I was washing the dishes, I left a glass of water on the windowsill. There was no reason for it. I'd been rinsing cups, one stayed behind, and I just left it there. The sun hit it in a certain way, the water glinting, catching the light, and it felt like it meant something, though I couldn't have told you what. The next day he came back. Another delivery. Another knock. I noticed his eyes flick up, just briefly, toward the window as he waited for me to open the door. Did he see the glass? Did he notice? I didn't ask. That evening, after my husband had left for another dinner, another late meeting, I walked into the kitchen and saw that same glass sitting there. It was ridiculous, but I didn't move it. Somehow, that untouched glass felt like the only thing in the house that was mine alone. Days passed like that. The courier came and went, each time with that same bright smile, each time with the same quick glance at the window. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe I didn't. But a thought took root in me. What if the glass was a signal? What if he understood? It wasn't that my marriage was bad. People always think stories like this come from misery, from cruelty, from fights and shouting and slammed doors. That wasn't us. My husband wasn't cruel. He was kind, in the way people can be kind when they're distracted by their own lives. He asked how I was, and he listened to my answers in the same way you listen to a weather forecast, just enough to nod, not enough to remember. I don't know when the ache started. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't one thing. It was the slow realization that I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt someone look at me and really see me. That's what the courier did, without even trying. One afternoon, I caught myself brushing my hair before his usual delivery time. I told myself it was because I'd been meaning to, but I knew better. I even changed my blouse, something lighter, something I hadn't worn in months. When he knocked, I opened the door a little faster than usual. "Hi," he said, and smiled that same careless, warm smile. "Hi," I answered, pretending not to notice how my own voice sounded different. He handed me the package, and our fingers didn't touch, but I thought about it. I thought about how close they were. That night, as I turned off the lights in the kitchen, I saw the glass still on the windowsill. It caught the moonlight now, not the sun. I should have moved it. I should have put it away. But I didn't. I left it there. And that was the beginning of everything. The glass became more than just a piece of glass. It became a part of the day, a marker between what was ordinary and what wasn't. I'd find myself wiping its rim, adjusting it so the sunlight would hit it just right, as if the way it shone mattered. I don't remember consciously deciding that it would be a signal, but somehow, that's what it became. The thought of him seeing it from the street, of him knowing it was there, created a strange current inside me. It was foolish, almost childish, but it gave me something to feel. The morning he noticed was the morning everything shifted. He came by earlier than usual, the kind of early that made me wonder if he'd planned it. I saw him through the window before the doorbell rang. His head turned slightly, his eyes caught on the sill, and then back to the door. He had seen it. I knew he had. And when I opened the door, his smile was different, not wider, not more obvious, but quieter somehow, as if we'd both agreed on something we hadn't spoken. He handed me the package, and our hands almost touched, almost brushed in that space of almosts where so much can happen. He thanked me, and I thanked him, and it should have ended there. But I hesitated. Just a second longer than necessary. And he noticed. That evening I kept replaying it. That brief pause. The way his gaze lingered. I couldn't explain why it mattered, but it did. I thought about the glass. I thought about whether he'd look for it tomorrow, whether he'd expect it. The thought made my stomach twist in a way I hadn't felt in years, not dread, not guilt, but a restless anticipation that felt dangerous in its own quiet way. The next day, the glass was there again. I left it deliberately this time, though I still told myself it was nothing. When he came, his eyes flicked to the window again, quicker this time, as if confirming something. When I opened the door, I felt the air between us differently. It wasn't heavy yet, but it had weight. My husband was home that evening. He talked about a new client, about numbers and schedules, about a dinner he'd have next week. He didn't notice that I kept glancing toward the window, or that my responses were short, distracted. He didn't notice that I'd changed the way I tucked my hair behind my ear, or that I was wearing a blouse I hadn't worn in months. He didn't notice anything at all. The courier came again 2 days later. This time, he didn't stand at the door. He lingered near the gate, waiting, almost like he wanted me to come out to him. I did. I don't know why I did, but I did. I stepped out, the sun hitting the pavement, the quiet of the street wrapping around us. We stood there, awkward and not awkward at the same time. He asked something simple, about the address, about whether the name on the package was spelled right. But the way he said it, the way he stayed just a little too close, made it clear that the words weren't what mattered. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, the kind of pulse you feel when you're too aware of yourself. He smiled, not the careless smile he'd worn before, but one that seemed almost cautious, as if testing something. And then there was a silence. One of those silences that feels like a choice. We were standing close enough that I could see the flecks of sunlight in his eyes, close enough that I could smell the faintest trace of soap on his shirt. The silence didn't break with words. We kissed. Just those words. That's all there is to say about it. But the simplicity of it doesn't make it small. When it ended, we both stepped back, as if some invisible wire had been pulled between us and then snapped. He looked at me for a long moment, not questioning, not apologizing, not promising anything. Just looking. And then he left. I went back inside and closed the door, my back pressing against the wood like it was holding me up. I touched my lips, not because they burned or ached, but because I couldn't believe they had done what they had done. For a long time, I just stood there. The house felt different, though nothing in it had changed. The kitchen looked the same, the hallway smelled the same, but it wasn't the same house anymore. I found myself looking at the glass on the windowsill. It sat there in the fading light, and I thought about taking it away. I thought about emptying it, washing it, putting it back with the others. But I didn't. I left it there. That night, I lay in bed next to my husband. He turned off the light, rolled onto his side, and fell asleep the way he always did, fast, like he'd been waiting for sleep all day. I stared at the ceiling and listened to his breathing. I didn't feel love, not the kind people write about, not the kind in songs. But I didn't feel hate either. That was the part that hurt. The absence of feeling, the quiet nothingness of it. I thought about the courier's smile, the way his hand had almost touched mine, the way his lips had actually touched mine. And I thought about the glass of water waiting on the windowsill for tomorrow. The morning after that kiss, I stood at the window far longer than I should have, staring at the glass as if it might give me an answer. The sunlight caught the rim and threw a thin line of brightness across the counter. It looked so ordinary, yet it felt loaded with meaning, like it had been transformed into some sort of silent beacon. I wondered if he would come again today, if he would look for it, if he would think I'd left it there for him. The house was still, the kind of stillness that makes you hear things you wouldn't normally notice, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the tick of the clock, even the sound of my own breathing. I realized how much I'd been leaning into those small sounds, how much I'd been filling the emptiness with tiny distractions. For years, that was how I lived, stacking up chores and habits to cover the silence, to make it bearable. But now, there was something else under it. A low thrum of anticipation, a pulse that made every sound sharper. When my husband left for work, it was the same as always. He kissed me on the cheek, a polite, automatic gesture that had no warmth in it anymore. "I'll be late tonight," he said, not looking up from his phone. I nodded, murmured something, and watched him walk out. It struck me that his voice no longer changed when he spoke to me. There was no difference between how he spoke to me and how he spoke to the taxi driver. I should have felt angry. Maybe I should have felt nothing. Instead, I felt hollow and waiting. The courier didn't come that morning. I found myself glancing out the window more times than I could count, each time telling myself to stop, each time not stopping. The glass sat there like a promise I wasn't sure I had made. By the afternoon, I told myself I was being foolish. It was just a delivery boy, just a package, just a kiss that shouldn't have happened. It didn't mean anything. But I couldn't quite make myself believe the words. The next day, he came. I saw him walking up the path, his steps a little slower than before, his gaze finding the window almost before he reached the door. That glance, quick but unmistakable, sent something sharp through me, like being caught and wanted at the same time. I opened the door before he rang the bell. "You're early," I said. My voice sounded strange in my own ears, lighter, as if I was pretending to be casual. "Had another stop nearby," he replied, and handed me the box. His fingers brushed mine this time, just slightly. Enough for me to feel the warmth of his skin. Enough for me to know it wasn't an accident. I thanked him. He nodded. And for a moment, neither of us moved. It wasn't a long moment, but it held something. A pause heavy with what couldn't be said. Then he smiled, not the wide, easy grin I'd seen before, but something quieter. Something that made it hard to breathe. When he left, I closed the door and leaned against it. The wood felt cool against my back. I felt almost dizzy, as if I'd been holding my breath and hadn't realized it. I told myself to put the glass away. But I didn't. Days began to fall into a rhythm. My husband's absences became my cover. He'd leave early, come back late, sometimes barely speaking more than a few words over dinner. I started dressing a little differently in the mornings, even when I knew I wouldn't see anyone else. I found myself smoothing down skirts, brushing my hair with more care, looking at myself in the mirror and trying to find the woman he had looked at. The glass stayed on the sill. It became almost absurd, how much meaning I gave it. There were mornings I left it empty, just to see if he'd still come. And he did. There were afternoons I filled it again, catching the light just so. I started wondering if he knew what I was doing, or if he was playing the same game in reverse. Once, he didn't come for 3 days. Those days felt longer than they should have. The house was heavy with the kind of quiet that gnaws at you. I kept telling myself it didn't matter, that it shouldn't matter, but the fact that I kept saying it only made it clearer how much it did. When he finally showed up again, I almost laughed with relief when I saw him through the window. He smiled when I opened the door, like nothing had happened, and I found myself smiling back, though my hands were shaking just a little. He started staying longer. At first, just an extra minute at the gate, then another by the porch. He'd ask questions, innocent ones, about the neighborhood, about deliveries, about the weather, and I'd answer, knowing the words were just a way to keep standing there. One morning, he offered to carry the box inside. "It looks heavy," he said. It wasn't, not really, but I let him anyway. He stepped into the hallway, and the air changed. I could feel it, the shift in the space, the awareness of another presence where there hadn't been one before. He stood there for only a moment, but it was enough. Enough for me to notice how the light fell across his face, how the smell of outside clung to his jacket, how close we were standing. And then he left, just as simply as he'd come, and the house felt empty in a way it hadn't before. That night, I dreamed of footsteps on the path, of a knock on the door, of a glass of water glinting on the sill. When I woke, I found myself looking toward the window. The hallway felt too narrow for the both of us. The air felt thick, like the walls were holding their breath. He glanced at the window, and I wondered if he noticed the absence of the glass, if he understood what it meant, or what it was supposed to mean. I offered him tea. My voice sounded thin to my own ears, but he nodded, and I busied myself in the kitchen. The familiar motions, filling the kettle, choosing a mug, felt different with him standing just behind me. The sound of the water boiling seemed louder than usual. I kept my hands steady, though my fingers wanted to tremble. We sat at the table, the space between us feeling smaller than it was. He didn't talk much. He asked about the neighborhood, the weather. The words didn't matter. The pauses did. There were moments when the silence felt almost unbearable, not because there was nothing to say, but because there was too much. At one point he looked directly at me and said quietly, "You look like you've been waiting for someone else." I didn't know what to do with that. My mouth opened, but no words came. I let the steam from the tea rise between us, pretending it was the reason I couldn't see his face clearly. He didn't stay long, but long enough for the air of the house to shift. When he left, the space he had filled didn't feel empty, it felt unsettled, like something had been moved out of place, though you couldn't quite say what. I sat at the table long after he'd gone, my hands wrapped around the warm mug even though the tea had gone cold. The kitchen felt changed somehow, even though every object was in its place. When my husband came home that evening, I listened to him talk about his day. His words fell into the air the way they always did, like stones into water, they made ripples, then sank. I nodded, I smiled, I asked the right questions. He didn't notice that the glass was gone from the sill, or that there was something different in my voice when I spoke. Later, after he went to bed, I stood in the kitchen in the dark. I opened the cupboard, pulled the glass out, and placed it back on the windowsill. It caught the moonlight just like it always did. I stared at it for a long time, wondering what it really meant now, wondering if it had ever meant anything at all, or if we were the ones who gave it meaning just to justify what we were already doing. The house was silent again, but the silence wasn't the same. It no longer felt like the absence of something. It felt like the presence of something I couldn't name. The days after he came into my house stretched and blurred. They had weight, like the air before a storm. Every sound seemed louder, the kettle boiling, the clock ticking, the crunch of gravel under approaching footsteps. And in that wait, I found myself waiting, even when I didn't want to admit that I was. I noticed how much I had started to live in the rhythm of his visits. I wasn't just glancing at the window anymore, I was checking it, expecting something. I found myself choosing my clothes in the morning not based on comfort, but on how they might look if someone happened to notice. A blouse that had been in the back of the wardrobe for months suddenly seemed like the right choice. I smoothed my skirt, I brushed my hair twice, sometimes 3 times, as if brushing away the quiet years that had settled on me like dust. The glass on the sill became almost like a dare to myself. Each time I placed it there, my fingers lingered on its rim. Each time I left it empty or filled, I wondered if he would notice the difference, if he would read meaning into the smallest choices the way I did. Then one morning, he didn't come. Not that morning, not the one after. 3 days passed with no knock on the door. The silence of those days pressed down on me in a way I hadn't expected. It was heavier than the silence of my husband's long work trips, heavier than the empty hours that used to fill my afternoons. I told myself it was ridiculous, that this was nothing, that I was nothing to him, that he was just someone who happened to bring boxes to my door. But the very fact that I had to repeat those words, over and over, told me how much they weren't true. When he finally came back, It was like a breath I hadn't known I'd been holding. I saw him coming up the path before he even knocked. He was smiling, but there was something in his smile, maybe an apology, maybe just awareness. "You've been busy?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Some days are like that," he said. He stood at the gate for longer than he needed to. There was no package that required explanation, no form for me to sign. But he stayed, and I stayed too. Our words were small things, about traffic, about the weather. They didn't matter. What mattered was that neither of us moved. One afternoon, he came when my husband had left for an overnight trip. The timing felt dangerous, but it also felt inevitable. He walked up the path slowly, as if he knew he didn't have to hurry. We stood close to the door, but neither of us crossed the threshold. The air between us was thick with everything we weren't saying. I don't know who stepped closer first. Maybe we both did, without meaning to. Maybe it was simply that the space between us disappeared. We kissed. There isn't more to say about the kiss itself. Just those words. But they were enough. This one was different. Not a question, not a mistake, not a thing that could be brushed away. It was a choice. When we stepped back, the world didn't look the same. I closed the door after he left, and the sound of it shutting seemed louder than usual, like the click of a lock that had been thrown on something inside me. I leaned against it, feeling the weight of what we had done, not guilt exactly, not yet, but something heavier than the air. I went to the mirror. I stood there, looking at my own reflection for longer than I had in years. There was a light in my eyes I hadn't seen for so long that I almost didn't recognize it. It didn't feel entirely good. It didn't feel entirely bad. It felt dangerous, and it felt real. When my husband called that evening to say he would be another night away, I listened to his voice, steady and distracted on the other end of the line. He talked about meetings, about schedules, about hotel rooms that all looked the same. I told him I hoped he was eating well. My voice sounded calm, almost normal. But when I hung up, I stood in the kitchen, looking at the glass of water on the sill, and I realized I didn't know who I was leaving it there for anymore, him or myself. The days after that second kiss felt sharper, more defined, as if someone had drawn a heavy line through my life and I was standing on the wrong side of it. I couldn't pretend anymore that it had been nothing. That kiss wasn't an accident, wasn't a slip that could be smoothed over with silence. It was a decision, and decisions have weight. I found myself waiting in a different way now. Before, it had been an uncertain, tentative anticipation, half fear, half curiosity. Now, there was something heavier, almost impatient. I started looking out the window even before I'd finished my morning coffee, glancing down the street like I might will him into existence. My husband was home more that week. His presence didn't bring comfort, it brought contrast. He moved through the house with his familiar steps, his familiar sighs, his familiar phone pressed to his ear. He spoke about work in the same tone he used to ask if we needed bread from the store. I realized I could answer all his questions automatically without even thinking. There were moments when I looked at him and felt almost disoriented, like I was seeing a stranger who happened to wear my husband's face. We hadn't fought, we hadn't even argued, but we hadn't connected either, not in any way that mattered. The courier came again, but something was different. His steps were slower, his shoulders a little tenser. There was no package that day, he said something about just stopping by. He stood by the porch, his hands in his pockets, his voice quieter than usual. "I'll be gone for a while," he said, almost as if he didn't want me to hear him. "Gone?" I asked, though I already knew what he meant. "Work. Some routes are changing. Could be a few weeks." The words sat between us like a stone. I couldn't find anything to say. It shouldn't have mattered. That's what I told myself. He was just someone who delivered things to my house, someone who had kissed me twice. That was all. But the idea of his absence cracked something open in me. He noticed it. I saw it in his eyes, the way they lingered on my face, the way his mouth pressed into a line like he might regret telling me. I tried to keep my voice steady. "A few weeks isn't forever," I said. He nodded, but neither of us really believed the reassurance. That night, I sat in the kitchen long after my husband had gone to bed. The glass of water was on the sill, catching the dim light from the street lamp outside. I stared at it until my eyes blurred. I didn't move it. The next few days dragged. There was no knock on the door, no footsteps on the path, no glance at the window. The silence of those days was different from all the silences before. It wasn't just absence, it was absence I could feel like pressure against my chest. My husband asked why I seemed quiet, but his voice was half distracted, his eyes already on his phone. I told him I was tired. It wasn't a lie, not really. I started leaving the glass on the sill even when I didn't expect him. It wasn't about him seeing it anymore, it was about me seeing it. It became a strange sort of ritual, as if that one small act could hold me together. One afternoon, I caught myself staring at my reflection in the window, not at the glass. I studied the lines around my eyes, the curve of my mouth, the tilt of my shoulders. I looked for signs of the woman I used to be, or maybe the woman I thought I could become again. The days passed, and he didn't come. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself over and over. But when I walked into the kitchen at night and saw the glass on the sill, glinting faintly in the dark, I knew I was lying. It mattered. It mattered more than I wanted to admit, more than I could say out loud, even to myself. The weeks he was gone stretched longer than I expected, like an elastic pulled so tight I was afraid it might snap. Every day felt heavier. Each morning I woke to the same view, the glass of water sitting untouched on the windowsill, the same street outside, the same silence. I would look out, hoping to see him even when I knew he wouldn't be there. The air in the house felt different during those days, almost too still, as if it was waiting with me. I had started to tell myself stories just to make sense of it. Maybe he'd found another route, maybe he was doing something else entirely. Maybe I would never see him again. The thought scared me, not because of what I'd lose, but because of what it said about me, that I had built so much on someone who barely belonged to my world. The day he returned, there was no warning. I hadn't seen him for so long that I had stopped expecting the sound of steps on the gravel. And then they were there. I heard it first, that familiar crunch of footsteps on the path. I froze at the sink, my hands wet from rinsing dishes, my heart suddenly loud in my ears. I didn't even have time to move the glass. The knock on the door was softer than usual. Almost hesitant. When I opened it, he stood there. No package, no uniform, no excuse. Just him. "I came back," he said. I didn't ask why. Something in his voice, in the way he stood, told me this wasn't like the other times. He didn't need a reason to be here, and I didn't need to invent one. I stepped aside. He crossed the threshold, and everything felt different, the way the hallway seemed smaller, the way the light from the window hit his face, the way my own breath felt louder in my chest. I don't remember what we said first. Maybe there were words, maybe there weren't. What I do remember is the weight of the moment, the way it pressed down on both of us, the way it pulled us forward. We didn't talk about what had happened before. We didn't talk about the days apart. There was no plan, no conversation to prepare for what came next. We spent the night together. I won't say more about it than that. I don't need to. Those 5 words hold enough. In the dark, the house felt like another place. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator, the faint rustle of curtains in the breeze, and underneath all of that, the sound of my own breathing, uneven and real. When the first light of morning came, I lay still, my eyes tracing the lines of the ceiling, my mind caught somewhere between clarity and confusion. He left quietly, his steps on the gravel fading as the sun rose higher. I didn't move for a long time. The kitchen was the same as it had been, the glass still on the windowsill, the room smelling faintly of last night's tea. But the silence was different now. It wasn't the same kind of emptiness I had lived with before. It felt like something irreversible had settled into the walls. When my husband came home later, he spoke about his trip, about airports, about meetings that ran late, about how he hadn't slept well. I listened, nodding, answering when I had to. But inside, something had shifted. I couldn't stop thinking about the way the night felt, about the way the house had felt with someone else in it, about how easy it had been to cross a line I thought would be harder to cross. And yet, when I looked at the glass on the sill, I didn't move it. I left it there. The morning after he left, the house felt hollow in a way I couldn't have prepared for. It wasn't the same emptiness I'd lived with for years, the quiet that came from routine and habit. This was different. It was sharper, as if the walls themselves remembered what had happened, and I was left standing inside those memories, unable to step out of them. I woke early, before my husband stirred. The room looked the same curtains, the same dresser, the same faint light filtering in through the blinds, but it didn't feel the same. It felt heavier, as if the air itself was carrying a secret I couldn't hide from. I went to the kitchen out of instinct, the way I always did, but the moment I saw the glass still sitting on the windowsill, I stopped. It was just a glass of water, and yet it seemed to stare back at me, accusing or reminding, I couldn't tell which. That day passed slower than any day should. I kept expecting to hear his steps on the gravel, the knock at the door, the soft, almost hesitant voice saying he was just nearby. But none of it came. And then the next day came. And the day after that. No knock. No steps. No sound. The absence began to feel physical, like something pressing against my chest. I caught myself glancing out the window constantly, even when I told myself not to. I told myself I didn't care, that what had happened didn't mean anything, that it was something that could simply be left behind like an unfinished cup of tea. But the truth was clear in the way my stomach twisted every time I looked at the empty street. My husband noticed something in me. "You've been quiet lately," he said one evening, his voice casual, distracted, his phone still in his hand as he scrolled through emails. "I'm just tired," I said, my own voice too steady, too quick. He nodded and didn't look up again. That was the thing about him, he never pressed. He never dug. He let things rest where they fell, and for years I thought that was a kindness. Now, I wasn't so sure. Maybe it was just another way he didn't see me. The courier didn't come back the following week either. Or the week after that. By the second week, something inside me began to ache in a way I couldn't quite name. It wasn't just missing him, not really, not only. It was missing the version of myself I had felt in his presence, the woman who had brushed her hair a little more carefully, who had looked at her reflection and seen a spark she thought was gone. I began to notice the silence in the house more acutely. Every sound became a reminder. The refrigerator hum felt louder, the tap dripping seemed endless, the ticking clock in the hallway started to feel like it was counting something down, though I didn't know what. One afternoon, I stood in front of the window and stared at the glass. The water inside was stale now, a thin film gathering at the edges, the light hitting it in a dull way that didn't catch anymore. I thought about throwing it out. I thought about washing the glass, drying it, and putting it back in the cupboard with the others, erasing this ritual as if it had never been there. But I didn't. I left it. It felt like a stubborn act, though I didn't know if it was stubbornness for him or for myself. Days bled together, and the absence began to feel permanent. I started looking for him in other faces. Every time a delivery truck slowed on the street, I found myself standing by the window, my breath caught in my throat, waiting to see if it might be him. It never was. Every time a shadow moved past the window, I wondered if it was his. The answer was always no. My husband kept coming and going, speaking about his work, about numbers, about his plans for next month, next year. I listened, nodded, filled in the silences where I had to. But I realized something one night as I stood in the dark kitchen, looking at that glass on the sill, the water now more of an idea than a drink. I wasn't just waiting for him. I was waiting for something to break this stillness, for something to prove that I wasn't just a shadow in my own life. He didn't come back that week. And still, the glass stayed on the windowsill. The weeks without him began to feel like seasons, each day shifting just slightly but never bringing anything new. I found myself moving through my own house as if I were a guest, aware of every creak in the floorboards, every draft from the window, every silence between sounds. The glass on the windowsill stayed there, untouched, and I wondered how something so ordinary could feel so heavy, like it was holding the weight of every choice I'd made. By then, I had started looking for him without realizing I was doing it. Every courier who passed down the street caught my attention. Every figure in a jacket made my chest tighten, and for a split second, I hoped it might be him. But it never was. The absence of him didn't feel like a clean cut, it felt like a slow unraveling. Days stretched out, and I felt myself fraying at the edges, threads pulling loose one by one. I tried to fill the spaces with the usual routines, laundry, cooking, sorting through drawers, but the things that once felt like structure now felt hollow. Sometimes I caught myself standing at the window, staring at the street for long stretches without moving. It wasn't that I expected to see him every time, it was that I didn't know what else to do with my waiting. One afternoon, the neighbor stopped by unexpectedly, just to ask about some leaves from our tree drifting into her yard. She glanced at the glass on the sill, then looked at me for a moment longer than was comfortable. "You always keep water there?" she asked lightly, her tone casual, but I felt my chest tighten all the same. "Yes," I said quickly, too quickly. "It's just a habit." She nodded, didn't press, and left. But the question stayed. I stood in the kitchen for a long time afterward, staring at the glass, seeing it through her eyes. It looked ridiculous now, just a glass, sitting there every day, always there, like some strange ritual. I thought about taking it down that night. I thought about washing it, drying it, tucking it back into the cupboard, and pretending it had never been there at all. But my hand hovered over it and didn't move. The circle of water at the bottom had left a faint ring on the sill, a ghost of itself even when the glass would eventually be gone. That mark felt like proof, like something that couldn't be erased even if I tried. My husband was home more often those weeks. He noticed the way I looked out the window sometimes, the way I paused mid-sentence, mid-task, like I'd forgotten what I was doing. "You've been distant," he said one night, his voice a mix of observation and mild concern. "I'm just thinking," I replied. "About what?" I couldn't answer. Or maybe I didn't want to. He didn't push, the way he never did. That had once felt like kindness, now it felt like distance dressed as gentleness. Nights were the worst. Lying awake, the ceiling above me too white, too blank. My mind would wander to places I didn't want it to go, back to footsteps on gravel, to a knock at the door, to moments that had shifted everything in ways I couldn't undo. I wondered if he thought about me. I wondered if he remembered the glass. I wondered if he would ever come back. But more than wondering about him, I wondered about myself, who I had been before all of this, who I had become because of it, and whether the difference between those two women could ever be undone. The glass stayed on the sill, a small, stubborn thing. And I stayed standing in front of it, day after day, waiting for a sound on the path that might never come. There's a point where waiting turns into something else entirely, something heavier, something you stop feeling like you chose. That's where I found myself in those final weeks. I wasn't just waiting for him anymore. I was waiting for the version of myself that had surfaced when he was around, that small spark of someone I thought I'd lost. I woke up one morning and saw the glass on the windowsill exactly where it had always been, the faint ring of water beneath it darkening the paint. The sight of it no longer brought anticipation. It brought a dull ache, the kind you feel when you look at a photo of someone you know won't walk back into your life. My husband's voice broke the quiet that morning, calling from the hallway about his plans for the day, about errands and emails and the usual motions of his life. I answered him, but my words felt automatic, like muscle memory rather than thought. He didn't notice that I barely looked up, or if he did, he didn't ask why. The neighbor waved to me through the kitchen window that afternoon, and for the first time, I felt the heat of embarrassment crawl up my neck. She didn't say anything about the glass this time, but I imagine she thought about it. Maybe she wondered why it was always there, or maybe she didn't think about me at all. The day stretched into another, and another. There were no footsteps on the gravel. No knock on the door. No voice saying he had just been nearby. At some point, I stopped expecting them. I didn't even notice the shift at first. It crept in quietly, the way so many changes do. One evening, as I rinsed the glass, I realized I had stopped checking the street before I fell asleep. I wasn't listening for the crunch of shoes on the path. I was just living. And yet, the absence of him had left something behind. I thought about what he had been to me, not just a person, but a mirror. He had reflected back a version of me I had forgotten existed, someone who could still feel the rush of being noticed, someone who could still imagine herself as more than a shadow moving through her own house. That realization stung more than I wanted it to. My husband came home late that night, his tie loosened, his phone in his hand. He sat at the table and talked about meetings, about a colleague who had annoyed him, about traffic on the highway. I listened, nodding at the right moments, placing plates in front of him, keeping my face steady. He didn't notice the way my gaze drifted toward the window, toward the sill. Later, when the house was quiet and the dishes were done, I stood in the kitchen again. The glass sat there, half-filled, the water stale. I picked it up. For a long moment, I just held it, my fingers around the cool curve, feeling the weight of what it had come to mean. I didn't pour it out right away. I thought about all the mornings I had placed it there, the deliberate act of setting it in the sun, the way my heart used to quicken at the thought of him seeing it. I thought about all the evenings I had left it untouched, too afraid or too unwilling to take it away. Finally, I tipped it, the water slipping out in a thin stream into the sink. I washed the glass slowly, rinsing it until the water ran clear, and dried it with the dish towel. I didn't put it back on the sill. I set it in the cupboard with the others, its place among them making it look like nothing special. But I knew. I knew that the faint ring on the sill would remain, a small mark that no amount of scrubbing would quite erase. It wasn't just a ring of water, it was proof of everything that had happened, of the choices I had made, of the pieces of myself I had discovered and the ones I had lost. When I turned off the light in the kitchen that night, the window reflected my face. For a second, I didn't recognize the woman looking back at me, not because she was unrecognizable, but because she was complicated. She was someone who had wanted more. Someone who had crossed a line. Someone who had been left standing in her own kitchen with the memory of a glass of water and all the weight it carried. I walked down the hallway, the house quiet around me, and I realized something. I would never tell my husband. I would never explain the glass, or the footsteps, or the nights when the silence felt almost unbearable. But I would also never forget. Because some things don't leave, no matter how cleanly you wash the glass or how neatly you place it back on the shelf. They stay. And I would carry that with me, quietly, for the rest of my life.